My name is Stephen Fingleton. I'm a writer-director from Northern Ireland, but I've spent a lot of time living in London. I directed short films up until last year, where I made my first feature film. It's called Survivalist. It premiered this year in the Tribeca Film Festival, and it's just screened for the third time in France at the amazing Paris Fantastique.
How did you come up with the idea for this script?
I watched a documentary by an American filmmaker called Chris Smith. The film was called Collapse, and it was a documentary about peak oil. And I was very frightened by the premise, which, you know, to this day I find very plausible. The idea that in a world of ever-increasing resources, a decline in the production of the resources that we need could precipitate collapse. Not those resources running out, but merely a decline in their production. And I began to imagine strategies for how I would survive in a world like that. And that's where The Survivalist came from.
Which movies have been an inspiration for you?
I love many French filmmakers,
Okay.
like Clouseau, and Jean-Pierre Melville, particularly his use of procedure, his downbeat tone, his choice of palette, the lack of seeing into the interior of characters but believing them to be real, the metaphor between process and effort of the characters and filmmaking itself. All of these I find very inspirational. And other filmmakers like Spielberg and Zemeckis, perhaps what drove me into filmmaking. And as I've watched more and more films, I guess I'm most drawn towards people like Andrei Tarkovsky, the poetic filmmakers who tell stories in very, very unusual ways.
Your movie looks real. How did you go about making it look that way?
What was key to the film was that it looked authentic. So the first step was making sure the actors had the right body mass, had the right shape, the right look for a film set in the time of starvation. If you watch, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, you can see that all the actors are very well fed. They're all quite beefy. It's just not plausible. So about 9-10 weeks before the shoot, my lead actor Martin began dieting, and Alwyn Fuere, who plays the mother, she was dieting as well, and they were on diets for most of the shoot. Alwyn was on the diet the whole way through the shoot, and that was key for getting the right look. And then it was about getting the design right, so making sure the clothes were beaten down and were torn, making sure the cabin, which was built for the film, looked very worn, looked like it was very, very old, sourcing items which were very old. So the design was very key. And then on top of that, we didn't use very much artificial light. We tried to keep it as much naturally lit looking as possible. So that means the image is very dark and muddy, but you believe it.
Can you talk about your collaboration with Mia Gott? She's perfect in the role.
I hadn't seen anything Mia had done before I cast her. I cast her on the basis of advice from my US agency, WME, and they strongly suggested her for the role. We worked together on Magpie. We didn't really know each other when we worked on Magpie. Magpie was the short we made before we did The Survivalist, and I wasn't sure Mia was necessarily right, but when I brought on my casting director, Rose Wicksteed, she said, no, I think Mia's fantastic, I think she's great, and I talked to Mia extensively and we cast her in the feature. And well, the first day of rehearsals, I was a bit worried, and she was amazing right away. Her Irish accent was perfect. Her decisions, her preparation going into the role were excellent. She had everything she wanted to do planned before the shoot. And out of the three actors, she was the actor I needed to do the least amount of rehearsals and corrections with. Whereas with the other actors, it was more collaborative. It would be fair to describe Mia's performance as broadly being her own and something I just watched on her behalf and gave her advice. son.
Thank you. Which was the biggest challenge that you had during the production of this movie?
I would say the biggest challenge I had was possibly maintaining my relationship with my actors, my cast. We were very close, but that also meant that I had to give my trust to them. And on some occasions, two of the members of the cast made decisions which weren't necessarily, I feel, the best for the film, and I still had to keep giving my trust. So I found that very difficult in the sense that when you're being in a collaborative process and you give up a certain amount of control, it's very, very challenging. I would say that's the main element. Everything else is just business, but your relationship with your cast is very intimate, it's very personal, and I didn't realize how much it affected me until after the film.
What do you like about survival and visceral movies?
I was drawn towards making this film because it was a way of shooting a small film with a small cast in one location. It was something I could self-finance. Most of the decisions the film makes are based around that, rather than me having a particular affection for post-collapse movies. I call them post-collapse rather than post-apocalyptic. So, for example, we didn't have a big budget, so we couldn't show ruined cities, but we could turn that to our advantage because it was in the audience's imagination as to what the cities looked like, as to what the rest of society looked like. They would work out the shape of the world from how it had deformed the characters. That was the approach I thought would be really interesting. The one film I would say was an influence in a big way that was post-event was Stalker. And Stalker is set in this kind of, initially on the edge of a town at the border of this strange zone that's been affected by aliens. And then the majority of the film is then set within the zone. But it's such an unusual movie. Most people don't consider it post-apocalyptic, although it clearly is. It's just that the Earth hasn't been hit by a meteorite. It's been hit by philosophically problematic supernatural phenomena. So that's the challenge for that. And I thought it was great. It's just a very mysterious film which doesn't meet your expectations. So I like working within a form where you might expect things to happen and then they didn't. Some of the things I regret in the film are the things that conform to your expectations. I think there's a version of the story that only has 3 characters. The film you will watch just has a lot more than 3 characters, even though they're smaller roles. But I think there would have been a way of telling the story with only those 3 characters had I more time.
In your movies, there are a lot of scenes with very little dialogue. How did you find inspiration to do that? It's original, it's good.
The idea behind the lack of dialogue in the film naturally came from my idea for the opening. I always knew the story would begin with Martin McCann's character, the survivalist, on his own. And obviously if he's on his own, unless you have flashbacks or something stupid, he's not going to say anything. So the script was 20 pages of silence. You know, it was just him doing things. And that kind of set the pace for the rest of it because I was comfortable writing scenes or sequences without dialogue. I don't believe in writing dialogue very widely anyway in a suspense film. It harms the film typically, unless it's a Tarantino type suspense film, which is based on the subtext to the subtext to the subtext of the dialogue. But what happened was, before we shot the film, we discovered the script was too long to shoot. It was only 100 pages, but the read-through was 3.5 hours long. And so we were in big trouble. So what I suggested was we cut scenes out. And so we instantly cut. First thing we cut was dialogue. And then the second thing we cut was scenes. And then when we were rehearsing, we would cut more dialogue. And then in the edit, we took out many of the dialogue scenes. And we tried to make it as silent as possible. In the edit, it was a deliberate goal in the montage to cut as many scenes with dialogue as possible. And there are many reasons for that. Just a little trick I've noticed is that people tend to act better in scenes without dialogue than with dialogue, because dialogue's very specific. I will write dialogue the way I will say it. But actors wouldn't say those lines in real life, so they have to become a character to think it. Whereas if somebody's performing actions, they can perform those actions in the exact way they would do them in life.
Your movie can be described as a total immersion experience. How did you go about creating it to be that way?
The intention was, while we couldn't compete with budget on other films, we could do things with the elliptical nature of how we presented the world and our use of our technical resources to immerse the audience in the film. And the way I saw it was, Avatar has 3D. We don't have 3D. We don't have special effects. But what we do have is a world without music. So we didn't have a score, and we recreated all the sound in post-production. And we spent a lot of time creating a very, very specific sound mix that would really involve the audience and take them to another place. It's extremely rare you see a film set in the modern era where there is no traffic. This is one of the reasons we couldn't use any of the location sound, because we had to take it all out. So I think sound was absolutely key in that. Trying to remove any interventions like music, like distractingly fake CGI, anything like that, taking that all away so the audience was sucked in. The structure of the film works that way as well. You have a single character on screen for 15 minutes and you think that's what the film is going to be, and then when the women arrive, your expectations have been surpassed. It's going to be a more exciting film than you expected. So by having an especially slow opening which forces the audience to pay attention to small details, when we show them big details, they have a much bigger effect. Just reading some of the reaction to the screening last night, there are some people did not get the film. They thought it was too long. They thought a lot of it was irrelevant. But there were other people who said from the first to the last minute they were great. So you have to trust that your audience will get it, and some of your audience won't. But the audience who gets it, that's who you make the film for. And I reckon it's about 40% of people who see it, it will have its full effect. We weren't trying to make a film for 80% or 90% of the audience.
The audience last night, as me, has really liked your movie. It's total original, it's a good immersion movie. Will be the theatrical release in France?
I wish I could tell you when the film was going to get released in France. Unfortunately, we do not have a distributor. We have, as yet, no plans to release in France. If there is a movie company if there's a distributor that you like, you can write to them, you can email them, you can tell them, do release this movie, it's good. I've came to France 3 times, I've talked to distributors, I've talked to press, I've tried to get a chance for French audiences to see it. Ultimately, if it doesn't get released in France, there are other ways you could find the film online, which I'm sure you're aware of, but it would be nice to get the Blu-ray, particularly because the Blu-ray will have the cinema sound on it, not the TV sound, it will have the cinema sound, and that's the way you should experience the film.
What are your favorite movies and what are your current projects?
I'm working on a film for a US company, which I can't say very much about, except it's a science fiction. And I'm also writing a thriller for a company called Working Title.
Good. My last question, what kind of advice could you give to someone who would like to work as a director?
Working as a director is a really interesting job in many ways. But what I would say is, if you think directed films will make you happy, that's not the case. You will never be satisfied with your work. You'll always want to work harder. You will find many of your negative personality traits are exacerbated by the resources and the opportunities directing provides. Therefore, if you're going to do it, you should be doing it for one reason only. It's because you believe you're talented. It's because you believe you have stories to tell an audience that nobody else on the planet can tell, and that audiences want to see it. And you will find that out over time. whether it's something you really, really want to do. Because if you don't, you won't get a chance to. You will want to have turned away from it on many occasions and done something else. You will have wanted the desire to leave you, but the desire has refused to leave you. In which case, you should go on. You should keep trying. The important thing is, think about the people watching the cinema. When you're on set and you're writing the script, you are their representative. You're the audience's representative. Every time you talk to the actors or you speak to the crew, you're doing it on behalf of the audience. You're not doing it for yourself, you're doing it for them.
Thank you very much, Stephen.